Hi, everyone. Thank you to Professor Ramana for that illuminating talk, for shedding light on the connections between defense and economics, and for addressing the parallels between science and technology and Karl Polanyi's double movement. We have time before the coffee break for a couple of questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, could you please write them on the index cards that you find in your program and just raise them, and a volunteer will come to collect them. Yes, thank you.
All rooms, they can just stand up and answer.
Ask your question as
well. Hi. Some very good comments. I like what Oppenheimer says. And is it perhaps correct to say that the scientists, when it comes to research grants, are no better than prostitutes?
As a non-card-carrying scientist, I'm going to duck that question. Let me also add, I don't want to answer that question also because it seems to imply something about prostitutes that I'm not sure I want to imply.
For 10 years, I was a member of a panel to dispose how to dispose of nuclear waste in Canada from the nuclear reactors, and I lost that one. And this weekend, I'm supposed to, as soon as I'm here, supposed to go up to Walkerton, which is a little town in Ontario, because the city council there has been bought off by the nuclear people to bury the waste under Walkerton, which is fairly near Lake Huron. And I'm wondering what comments you have on that.
Thank you for that question. I actually spent about a year studying your nuclear waste disposal policy, and I wrote a paper on it. And so your name is very familiar from that, all the research that I did there. And, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization in many ways is a unique organization around the world. It's come together, for those of you who do not know, that's the organization that's supposed to help decide how to deal with Canada's nuclear waste. And what I sense is happening, they came out with a very lofty set of statements about how this decision ought to be made, involving fairness and et cetera. But after that had been passed, and when the time came to actually pick places, what I observe is that it is basically a process of bribing. Right? You find some poor community somewhere which has lost all its jobs, maybe logging industry has gone from there, you find everybody's moving out, and you come and say, well, I can set up this fantastic high-tech operation here which is going to cost $10 billion, your local economy is going to be boosted, and go ahead for it. And of course, many places do sort of fall for that. One doesn't necessarily blame that. But I'm not sure that strategy is going to succeed for two reasons. One is, even though these locations might themselves vote through a perfectly democratic process to site one of these waste disposals, they happen to also be located in a larger area. The province has to say yes. All kinds of places through which these nuclear waste spent fuel rods have to be transported there have to say yes. And there, for many of those places, this $10 billion carrot doesn't apply, right? So there's a problem there. The second problem, I think, is it has to do with also a negotiation on the future of nuclear power, right? Now, many places realize that we've generated nuclear power for several decades now, we've accumulated a huge amount of spent fuel, radioactive waste, and we have to do something about it. Everybody agrees that. The question is, what does this tell you about the future? Should we be generating more or less, right? Now, if it's seen as such an onerous task that you have to bribe communities, then clearly it's not something which is good that is being produced, right? And so to the extent that you have to have a community that's going to say yes to it. They would like some reassurance that this is the last of the load that we're going to deal with, right? And that's, I think, one of the places where the negotiations break off, because the nuclear industry sees this exactly in the opposite way. They say, the moment we find one repository site, that takes away a huge source of opposition to nuclear power. And so, yes, we've solved nuclear waste problems, so therefore we can expand, right? And everybody realizes that. So there's this tension which is going to come up. And I don't, if it's not already derailed negotiations, it will derail negotiations, I would imagine.
If anyone has questions for Professor Polanyi as well, this is a good time to ask them.
Thank you very much indeed. Jody Williams, a great activist, spoke at the Landmines Treaty in Canada, in Ottawa. And she said, speaking of the people of the world, we are the great power. Or yes, we are the great power. I believe that. And I do believe that, as Jonathan Schell stated, it is the fate of the earth that is at stake. We need to act, all of us, on behalf of all children everywhere. That's our responsibility. Could you give us some guidelines on that, please? Thank you very much.
It would be extremely presumptuous for me to give guidelines on something like this. We all sort of, need to act in our own ways, and I'm not going to sort of say, this is how you should do it. In fact, I do think that trying to prescribe how movements should act is in a way very paralyzing, because then it ruins both creativity as well as does not take into account particularities of how movement organizing happens in specific localities. I will just sort of remark back to just one very brief thing, which is in the United States, for example, you've seen a virtual, I would not say decimation, but certainly something close to that, of grassroots peace movements, precisely because during the Bush years, there was a concerted strategy to try and do all your organization within the Beltway, within Washington, D.C. And that really sort of has, and part of it was going around telling people what they should do, right? And this is, I think, a profoundly problematic effort. It's something for a small group to decide that, this is what we should do, and then try to impose some kind of a group discipline, if you like, on that. It's a very different thing for one person or one central organization to do that over everybody else.
Thank you. This comment, my name is Doug Roach, and like Lois Wilson, I served in the Canadian Senate for some years, and I spent my whole life in the political arena, so I do not address you as a scientist, but as a politician. And I would like to reinforce very strongly what Professors Polanyi and Ramana have said about the potential and the strength of the role of the science community in affecting public policy. I can tell you that if you want to get rid of nuclear weapons, you cannot look only in the political arena. The politicians, this is worthy of a lecture or a seminar all by itself, the political arena is incapable of delivering peace and security in the world without the reinforcement of the professional communities, and I speak specifically of the science community. There is in this room, I'm sure, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 young scientists who, in the development of their careers, are going to have a wonderful opportunity to share their technical and scientific knowledge and make it applicable to the development of public policy. And I will close by giving an example of what I mean. The Pugwash movement that is represented here today was virtually founded by a man named Joseph Rotblat, who was a Polish physicist, a member of the Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb. And on the route through all the scientific work to get the bomb developed, Rotblat came to as a scientist, came to the decision that it was morally wrong to continue the development of this device, which would have such horrendous power of destruction, so on, that it was wrong. It was the wrong use of science to do that. So Rotblat left the Manhattan Project, for which he was ostracized by his fellow and his colleagues in the scientific community. And a whole lot of things happened to him. He ended up in England, and he did, though, translate his antipathy to the wrong use of science in starting the Pugwash movement, which for some half century now more has been espousing the cause of nuclear disarmament and working politically for it. So much so that in 1995, Rotblat and the Pugwash organization won the Nobel Peace Prize. So if you want somebody to look up to or to emulate or to inspire you, go online and find out more about Rotblat. And I'm sure that maybe in this room there will be future Rotblats.
Hopefully there'll be no future Manhattan projects to walk out of. Said hopefully there'll be no future Manhattan projects to walk out of.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. This question is either for you or for Professor Polanyi. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Canadian political context, but some people feel that it's not the friendliest to scientists. So there's some discussion of what might be called muzzling of scientists, so strict regulations on how government scientists are allowed to speak about their research, or the elimination of the long-form census. So can you comment on how you see the role of scientists playing in the public policy debate, given the current Canadian political context?
Refer to Professor Polanyi on this one. Long since I've been in Canada.
Well, it's a good question, but the muzzling of Canadian scientists has to do with scientists who are in the civil service orbit, and they are, in fact, being leaned on to clear their remarks with their bosses before they make them. And to some extent, that is legitimate, but it's unfortunate, too, because it is decreasing the value of important public debate. And so I'm glad that people like our questioner are talking about it. But there's another sort of muzzling, which is a self-censorship, which I haven't seen commented on in the press, and that is that the scientific community is not talking out in favor of the freedom that basic science in the country needs if it is to succeed. And if it is tethered, as I was trying to explain, by being required to identify, let's say, industries that will benefit from some basic science, it's involved in some exercise which is unreal, and there should be a lot of scientific voices raised against that, because it's going to be very damaging to science in Canada, and it's being done elsewhere too, and damaging to other science. So it's not just governments leaning on government scientists, it's scientists who could be speaking out but are not doing so. You might ask why not? It's because, at least, I can't read their minds, but in part it's because it isn't politic to bite the hand that feeds you.
I had one thing just to say, that this is by no means unique to Canada. There are many other places where this is happening.
Hi, I have a quick question. You mentioned the parallels between climate change and nuclear energy. What role do you see nuclear power play in climate change?
So not quite parallels. I think the question that comes up is if climate change is clearly a grave threat, and we need to try to do everything we can to avert that. Nuclear power is a low carbon source of energy. And the question is whether, therefore, it should be deployed in much greater numbers. And the first thing I'd say is I think climate is such an important problem that we have to think about it. We cannot duck that question. And it is to be part of the table. It should be on the table, as they say in the thing. The problem is that nuclear power is firmly on the table. It has been on the table for a very long time. It is supported by dozens of governments, huge numbers of corporations, propaganda, all kinds of things. And yet, if you look at the global contribution of nuclear power, it's declining. Right? The highest was in the early 1990s. It used to be about 17% of the world's electricity. As of last year, it had come down to 10%. It's sort of declining year by year. Even the most optimistic projections for nuclear power by, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency do not see nuclear power becoming any more than maybe 10 to 12% by the year 2030. Right? So it's not going to be a major source of electricity for sure. Right? The second question is where should nuclear power be deployed? If you think about the climate problem, and if you think about the climate problem as being one which is primarily because of the increasing amount of emissions versus what is the Earth's capacity to absorb it, much of the future and the current and the future increases in emissions are going to come from what are called developing countries. The China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, places like that, which are fast increasing economies where there are huge populations which still don't have access to electricity and modern energy services. It's in these countries that you should actually be sort of thinking about whether nuclear power is going to be deployed. The question is it realistic to imagine that many of these countries, for example, Indonesia, has had an Atomic Energy Commission for 30 years, right? And still they've not managed to deploy any nuclear power plants. India, that I've sort of studied, has had a nuclear power program for 60 years, has had the support from every government, from every high level of government, and yet it's only about 2% of the country's electricity, right? Is it actually realistic to imagine that nuclear power is going to be an important part in these kind of countries which do not have any experience with it, right? And the last thing which you have to sort of remember is that while climate change is a very serious problem, it is not the only problem, right? So, nuclear power has its own share of problems. I'm not going to elaborate on that. Everybody knows those things. And the question is whether you're going to trade one for the other.
I doubt it. Let's try. It's on. Now, I thought Dr. Ramana was making a more visionary point, which was a convergence in the long run between the two great fears that we must have, and one of them is that nuclear weapons get out of our control, and I think that's a very real danger, most likely through miscalculation. Threats are being made by nuclear powers, and increasingly so, and those threats have to be backed up, and there is a danger that they then become implemented as national prestige becomes involved. But what I heard Dr. Ramana saying was that great threat, which many people here are conscious of, could be linked with another great threat to humankind, which is climate change. And so I just wanted to mention that 13 years ago, there was a statement made by actually 110 Nobel Prize winners, which, 110 Nobel Prize winners is 90% of those who are alive, and they can be totally wrong, of course. But the statement that they made on the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize, 2001, was that we should think about these two great threats at the same time. If we proliferate nuclear weapons, and if we allow climate change to further impoverish those who are the most vulnerable to its effects. How will this spreading of weaponry affect their not only indignation but desperation? So that was the core of a statement in 2001 at the 100th anniversary of the Nobel Prize. I hope we make it to the 200th anniversary.
Dr. Ramana highlighted something that Robert Oppenheimer said in November 1945, his early feeling that it is good to turn over to mankind at large the greatest possible power to control the world and to deal with it according to its lights and its values. Now, if this is going to happen, we need very broad dialogue to occur across cultures, across varying perspectives on the nuclear movement itself, and across disciplines. So I'm very excited for this afternoon's panel, which will start in about 15 minutes. But in the meantime, please help yourself to refreshments that are outside of the room. Thank you.